At one point, the government was supposed to secure the medium, and then the free market operated within this medium that enables all of these micro economies to emerge organically. They're trying to also operate and allocate resources within the free and open market, which exactly what you're saying here, right? There's nothing that's going to substitute the free market. Nothing is a better allocator of resources than the free market. Yo, and welcome back to another episode of the Nyc and Griff Show. Today is Saturday, May 11th. It's 12:11 p.m. Griff, how are you feeling today, and what are you thinking about?
Feeling good. Thinking about the collective a little bit this morning, if you will. Just thinking about like other people and how news is going and where the news is going and what it seems like people are paying attention to and what's happening behind the scenes probably is what hits my mind a lot. As I listen to, for full disclosure, a lot of the podcasts that I listen to are anywhere from like the Dave Smith Show, Money Maulers, PDB, Joe Rogan, Tim Dillon, Tim Pool. So I guess you could say my opinions could be conservatively skewed from the stuff that I listen to. But man, like I've tried to listen to some of that left wing stuff. To be honest, like I try very hard to listen to the arguments of like, let me think of a guy on Twitter. I think his name's Ed, like Krastine or something like that, Crantonstein, something like that. And I listen to those arguments, and I'm just like, you guys are not very good at math. So like that's a huge problem. It's a big problem when half the country or more, a vast majority more, do not understand math and what's happening. So I guess that's where I'm at.
Okay, Nick. So Griff, I think this is, I don't really want to waste too much time. A couple things you just mentioned there. One thing you mentioned anyways, things going on under the hood, right? That seem like a lot of folks aren't aware of. And then you talk about, maybe trying to listen to or consume some left-leaning information or content. And you have a feel that they maybe don't understand some certain thing or group of things that you and I may. So let's unpack this a little bit. What kind of things specifically do you have in mind here? And what are some of the things you think that people just don't actually get? When you say math, that's pretty broad. So what do you mean when you say that?
I think the two biggest things or the two biggest problems in America today are the infatuation with net worth and quote unquote what equity is. And what it actually means, I think, is a huge problem. And then I think the other problem, quite simply, is as we talk about the money and why all the things are happening the way that they're happening right now, like what's happening, would be the Treasury market and just how awful it is and how many people thought that there would be rate cuts this year. And I can say the only prediction the Nyc and Griff Show has ever made, like legitimately, was saying in like January, December, whatever, when Bitcoin was going down, didn't matter what the economic conditions were. We were like, they're not going to cut rates. There is actually no room for them to cut rates if you're doing math. No room for them to cut rates. There's really nowhere for these guys to go.
Why is it that there's nowhere to cut? There's no room to cut rates. What do you mean when you say there's no room to cut rates?
Well, obviously inflation's a problem. So if you just go based on CPI, cumulative inflation has been about 25 cents. I mean, even that guy who did the Ohio State commencement speech, who got Pan Chris, I think is his name, he got laced. But he brought up a really good point, whether you want to boo him or not. 25% of your purchasing power, if all you did was hold dollars and you held like, say you just had a big pile of cash in your house in a safe. Let's just use that as the example. It's the easiest example. You've literally lost 25% of what the money in your safe is worth. And there's actually there's also these things called investment, right? Like a lot of our financial institutions, including the Federal Reserve, has had to get in what people would consider risk-off assets, and they have to get into things called treasuries. And those things are doing worse than just if you just held your money in a bank account, it'd be way better than if you got a bunch of treasuries that you bought 3 or 4 years ago at a long-term bond, if you will.
Okay,
And
now, so you're making a couple of assumptions here. So one, are you trying to say that the interest rate should be somewhere a lot closer to the inflation rate than it is, and or above that to get inflation under control? Would that be one thing you're suggesting here?
well, I
They
think
can't go down with interest rates, especially if it's below what they would deem as the inflation rate, because then inflation just starts to run away at a faster pace. Is that the thought?
well, like you would agree, like this is a game. The government is a game, money is a game. There are rules to the game, and there's always like two sides to the coin. So if you raise rates, what happens? I mean, you effectively kill every market in the world because we are the world reserve currency. And a lot of people are running off of whether it's the treasuries they own from us, how they finance their banks, but everything in regard to building business and economics today is driven by finance. You really can't get into a lot of businesses unless you just have a large sum of money.
How is that true, Griff? Whenever you say that interest rates affect the economy, the day-to-day operation of the economy, what do you mean by that? How are interest rates connected? Where does the rubber meet the road?
I mean, simplest form is if interest rates go up, then there has to be a spread from banks to give you a 30-year home loan. Does there not? And so if interest rates go up, there's probably like right now, there's about a 1.5 or 7% difference between the Fed funds rate to banks and the banks that are loaning you 30 years
Meaning
worth.
that one or so percent is the bank's profit. Is that what you're saying? They're playing a game of arbitrage.
Like one or so.
They're borrowing money from the Fed at X rate, and then they're lending it to you at X plus some
Right.
some number.
So they're making a little bit of money. Exactly.
So you're saying as the interest rate goes up, then the cost for the end consumer to also borrow money also increases.
Is
And
more
whenever we
expensive.
borrow, when less people are borrowing money, or sorry, it's incentivizing people to not borrow as much because it costs more. You're saying so that over time, and as that trickles down through the economy, that it slows things down.
Right. The easiest way for people to see it, or the way people perceive it now, would be your mortgage payment. And it has never been technically cheaper to rent versus buying right now due to the fact that interest rates have risen. And here's the problem, or at least what a lot of Bitcoiners predicted would be the problem. We printed too much money. If we don't really understand the total source of inflation and you're just going based on money printing, then inflation was a lot higher than what they raised rates to. And the reason why you want to keep rates at parity with inflation is because you need the cost of capital to be as hard to borrow as the money is easy. You can't just have one without the other. I mean, if you just let inflation run rampant and you kept rates at 0%, then everybody in the world would just own a home forever, and you would never have, you would essentially never have a crash until you reach a point where even 0% or 1% home loans is like not enough of a favor to give people over 30 years. So essentially, you have to make the money hard, right? You have to make the money. At least the Fed has to do a pretty good job of making the dollar hard enough that we can use it as a medium of exchange, as well as a store of value in certain aspects over a long period of time. And another fun thing about interest rates is that a lot of our markets, if you just take out the mortgage aspect of it, think about how banks are lending you money. Well, a lot of banks are going to take treasury yields, and treasury yields have always kept pace with interest rates. Like they're always right on line with each other. This is, I mean, entirely because they are pretty much trying to keep interest rates as high as inflation is going to be, while simultaneously they want it to be lucrative for banks to loan you money. I mean, it needs to make sense for them. So
Thinking about, I think this is kind of an interesting thought here, interesting questions to think about. Okay, the parity between inflation and interest rates. So in those, we would look at, we could have another debate about whether or not the CPI metric is an accurate representation, right? But let's go ahead just in this conversation. We'll say that inflation, the rate of inflation is the CPI rate that the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out. And we'll say that the interest rate is the prime rate with the Fed, that the Fed's got the interest rate set at, right? So you're saying that these two should essentially be at the same level to balance each other out.
Well, in order to make your money hard, right? Because if you just let inflation go to, if you just let inflation go to 20% without doing anything, then eventually it's going to run away from you. Eventually the money is just not going to be worth anything because you're just letting people borrow it into perpetuity forever. And the valuation of assets becomes like, what do you, at that point, like, it's kind of, honestly, it's already pretty much run away. If you just look at home prices over like the last 50 years, you could argue that this is exactly what they have done, is they've never actually gotten inflation under control. It's been a lot higher for a lot longer than people think. And the easiest way to track that is assets. Assets usually beat inflation or keep up with inflation if it's a good asset, especially if it's harder than the money that you're using. And so what's going on right now is that a lot of banks are holding their treasuries to maturity because they simply don't actually have any of the money that they claim that they have. And it's a very interesting time in why.
Do you think, well, they would be incentivized, especially because you mentioned earlier, right? Like that, you'd rather have bought X than bonds over the last couple of years because they've gone down so hard because interest rates have gone up so hard. Now,
right.
We get into some of the math here, and it does start to get a little tricky whenever you get into the details. But why would somebody, if something has been devalued, let's say it's now worth 50% of the value was whenever I bought it, but I know that if I hold this through the entire period of the contract, I will get all of my principal and all of the interest that was guaranteed. Why would I not hold that to maturity?
Well, I guess the only reason why you wouldn't hold that to maturity is people want more money than you have. So if your customers all come to you and they want money and you don't have it, you're going to have to liquidate something in order to give them your money, considering you're a bank and you're really supposed to be holding their money. What happens is a lot of these banks put it in these treasury yields for 10, 30 years, 5 years, whatever. There's a huge mix of them. And they're doing it because they get a fixed interest payment. And you're supposed to be able to keep your principal because you've never sold it. You never violated the contract. There is no penalty. But here's the problem. Here's the problem. Inflation is really bad. It did run away. They did have to increase rates. So if you bought treasuries in 2020, rates got, literally, this is insane if you think about it. Let's just say at January 5th, 2020, rates were roughly 2%. Meaning that if you put in $100,000, if you were like, you know what, I just want to be super safe with my money, I'm going to put $100,000 into a 10-year US Treasury, then you are going to get $2,000 a year broken up into 2 different payments for the next 30 years. And you will not be able to touch that original $100,000 until 2050. Now, what is happening over the course of time from 2020? Inflation's insane. So that interest payment that you're getting has not kept up with inflation, and you're actually getting the shit kicked out of you because you're losing to inflation by like 100%. So your yield is effectively not purchasing enough money to pay your customers.
And so to even simplify that, just one step further, the idea here is that what if I bought a bond that's yielding 4, 3, or 5%, let's say 5% in 2020, and then in moving forward into 2021, 2022, 2023, we see inflation rates that are higher than that 5%, meaning that original principal, that original capital that you put in there is yielding less than it's losing in value, is what you're saying.
There's 2 risks to treasuries. There's interest rate risk and there's inflation risk. And a lot of people have viewed those as very low risk, if not risk at all, for a long time. And the inflation risk is that the yield that you're getting is not going to be able to fulfill the orders from your customers if you're a bank, or if you're just a person living in life and you were going to retire, or you just wanted to get into something easy and try and build cash flow from these things, then you essentially would not be able to afford the rent, afford the mortgage, afford the property taxes, anything, food. You would not be able to buy as much with that interest payment, which, for example, was $100,000. Your $2,000 essentially in 4 years is buying $1,500 worth of stuff. This is not good, especially if you had basically promised people that, hey, if you lend me $50,000 each, like, I'll just start a bank, and then when you come back, and you need money, I'll be able to fulfill all of your requests via the interest payment, because that's all the money I suspect that you guys need. It's actually a little bit worse than that, to be quite honest, because in 2020, they got rid of the banking requirement to hold any of your money. And a lot of this was because they needed banks and they needed a lot of people to buy their treasuries, because our government, even though there was inflation risk, even though nothing really seemed good, they still wanted to borrow a bunch of money, borrow a bunch of our future time to fund wars, to fund student debt, to fund COVID, to fund, I mean, all of these things since 2020. And these things are expensive. And if you print more units of the money, that's exactly what inflation is. We don't have to get into anybody's opinion on inflation. Inflation is 100% in some way, shape, or form tied to just the amount of units you print of that money. And so to take it back, let's take it back. So you have $100,000. You are getting $2,000 a year. The interest rate is 2%. And oh, bang, it's 2024. Well, interest rates are, for a round number, let's say the interest rate rose to 4%. Here's the game. You don't have that much more capital than $100,000. Maybe you have $50,000 more dollars. So you buy another $50,000 worth of treasuries for 10 years or 30 years. And now you're getting $4,000 a year on that money, but your original money is still under contract. So that original money is still only going to get you $2,000. And on top of that, your principal payment is tied to the interest rate in which you signed the contract. So if rates go from 2% to 4%, your principal goes from $100,000 to $50,000. Should you sell before the contract has matured? Now, this doesn't sound like the worst thing in the world. It doesn't sound like it could be a problem until you exacerbate it out and you realize that the treasury market is hundreds of trillions of dollars and banks own trillions of dollars of treasuries. And so when their customers want more money and they're raising rates and things are a problem and all of the above, oh, my customers want money. Oh, no, I don't have the money. What can I do? I can try and ask the Fed for more money, or I can buy treasuries and get more yield. But if I ask the Fed for more money, then they do have to print more money and I can only get it at 5%. So what becomes the problem is you have a bunch of banks right now sitting in America that bought trillions of dollars. Let's round number again. If they bought $1 trillion worth of US Treasuries 4 years ago, they essentially right now are getting hammered by inflation because the yield that they're getting from those treasuries is not enough money to facilitate the things that they need to do, which is pay their customers, continue to give out home loans, continue to finance migrants, continue to give people bank accounts. I mean, just all kinds of stuff, right? It's every bank considering it's the Fed as well. I mean, so we're at a point basically where you're getting a yield that is, if your yield's 2%, inflation's been obviously at least 5% over the last 5 years. So you're losing, what is that, 160% against inflation. And on top of that, the principal money you put in, that $1 trillion these banks put in, is currently worth $300 billion. So if they did have to liquidate,
if they were to sell it, if they were
to get liquidated, if there was some form of a bank run or there was some sort of a recession, a problem, they needed to get liquid. If a bank needed to get liquid,
the reason that it's worth less is because if I can go to the bond store today and I can buy a bond that will yield me 5%. Why would I would not buy a bond that would yield less than 5% at the same price. I would buy it at a cheaper price. It's discounted because it doesn't yield as much as the bonds are current today. So the government is issuing bonds, and they are issuing bonds at a guaranteed yield of X, right? Whatever X is. And I would think that the ideology is that the government is going to take in this capital from the sale of these bonds. The people who buy them, the entities that buy the bonds, will hold that contract, and I will now be obligated to give them a certain yield payment on a recurring basis based on what that contract says. And the idea would then be that this capital that I get from the sale of the bond contract, I would go and I would allocate in certain areas that would generate additional income for myself. Now, what's income for a government? There's probably a handful of different ways, but primarily you'd say taxes is a huge deal, right? Tax income is a huge deal. So then where does the money that the government gets from bond sales be allocated to in order to increase tax revenue? And that's where things really start to get strange, because you start, like you mentioned, some of the things that the government has been funding here within recent years. You start thinking, okay, so wait a minute, how if we're gonna forgive student loans, how is that going to generate additional tax revenue? Okay, well, now hold on a minute. Let's think about it, right? If people don't have to pay X amount to their student loans, maybe they're reallocating those extra dollars and they're spending them in the economy, and that money circulating around the economy, it creates more sales tax, more sales revenue. Okay, that's interesting. What about funding wars over in another country, right? How does that generate tax income? Well, I guess there's probably a lot of American companies that work with the government via government contracts during war. Call them war contractors, right? The military industrial complex. These folks are American companies, and there's probably some foreign companies as well, obviously. And dare I say that there's any laundering going on and money that's coming back and going into certain people's pockets. But there are American companies that are earning profits from war, and those profits get dispersed through maybe American citizens, hopefully, and that maybe that could create more tax revenue. I mean, is that the idea, Griff? Is that governments issue bonds at a guaranteed rate, at a low risk guaranteed rate, and then they allocate that capital where they think it's going to generate new tax revenue, and then using that new tax revenue to pay for this bond servicing cost, to pay that yield that we're guaranteeing? I mean, that would be the idea. Unfortunately, though, what has happened is not that. It is that we've continued to spend on a deficit, and we've continued to have to issue more and more bonds because we need more money, because we're running out of our own money, because it seems like where we are allocating money is not bringing anything back.
Yeah, there's so many things to break down within that. Here's how like the government's involved, because we just explained like basic treasuries, right? And how basically every bank is insolvent if they had to get liquid today, which is not good, which means they do not have your money up to 100%. They would have to do so many different things. We didn't even talk about the repo market, which is essentially when banks do get liquidated, they need to find short-term money so that they can fulfill their customer requirements and then go buy back the same treasury from that person overnight.
And the question might be, who is that bank of last resort? Who buys exactly. the bad assets from the banks when the banks are going under?
And that's what that's what people aren't talking about. It's so interesting with the US government.
The answer is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is that bank. And where do they get the money to buy these assets?
At this point, it's not even
real. They could print and create new money. Maybe they've got some existing capital that they use, but I would think, I don't know. I guess that's the problem. That's the problem, right? We're an open market economy, supposedly, right? A capitalistic open market economy, free market economy. Yet a central bank that controls all of the lifeblood of what happens within the economy, which is the money, is a private entity with the closed doors and locked drawers that you can't see into.
Obviously, the bank and the government don't have a relationship. The Federal Reserve didn't have to get approved by Woodrow Wilson, and they don't have a relationship.
Conflict of interest.
Yeah, like the problem essentially has become that our government only recoups so much money a year from taxes, which is the only way they make money. From anybody who's listening to this, the only way a government makes money is by taxing people. They do not make money. As the current forms of government stand, the best form of government, I guess, is us. Representative democracies are a black hole for money. They do not make any money. They tax you. And then on top of that, they use treasuries as a form of credit to then tax you more in order to pay their credit card bills for things that they deem super important. So our biggest problem in this country right now is that we have politicians, whether they be right or they be left, it does not matter, that continue to get in office and try and spend out of their problem. And they try to essentially tell people, oh, well, I can cut taxes. I can make your life better. I can make this better. America is always going to have this ever-growing tax burden that's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is where it gets really interesting. Is there a way, and this is what nobody's thinking about, Are we getting to the point where there's no way to tame inflation at all? Are we getting to a point where the dollar is going to be worthless, where we are going to end up in some sort of Weimar Republic? Because if our interest payments become higher than our military budget, they become higher than our Medicare budget. What happens if interest payments become higher than our overall tax base? Well, what do you think they're going to have to do? I mean, are they not going to tax us at 90% like they have in the past? Are they not going to have to go to war in order to change economics, in order to change the focus and goal of the country to distract people from the fact that their lives are being printed out from underneath them? What are they going to do? Because that's kind of where it's at a little bit. I mean, that's why you see the Federal Reserve not hiking rates, but also not lowering them, because quite honestly, they're caught with their pants down and they don't know what to do because there's nothing for them to do. You increase rates, that means you essentially kill a housing market that, oh, wait, it's only bailout is the very person increasing the rates. So are you going to increase rates and then simultaneously drop everything to zero and bail them out as soon as it gets bad? No, you can't do that. Okay, so what's your other option? I mean, I guess you could keep rates the same, but it doesn't seem like 5% or 5.75% is really dampening things enough. I mean, the housing market's a little bit down from now that mortgage rates are kind of peaking over like the last 10 years, but it's not really doing as much as you would think. I mean, go to the grocery store. Have things not gotten more expensive this year? Look at gas and everything going on with wars. Are things not getting more expensive? Mortgage rates are getting more expensive. How do you track the inflation rate of homes? Do you track it in the asset valuation? Do you track it in the mortgage payment? It's very, very hard. And that's why it brings me all the way back to my other problem. Your house not only is not worth what you think that it's worth in equity, it's sitting on top of a pile of dog shit, worse than mortgage-backed securities, worse. It's actually now on the back of the Federal Reserve, who they themselves buy government treasuries now since 2008. They themselves, at the peak of inflation in 2020, said, we are going to start quantitative easing. Why the M2 money supply, even though that M2 money supply is probably a fake number, why did it go up last month? Probably because they need some liquidity. And if they need liquidity, amongst telling everybody that they're going to continue to hike rates, tell everybody they're going to pay off their debt, Federal Reserve says they're going to get rid of all of their treasuries, how are they going to actually do that? Well, how is that actually going to happen? Is there a way that it can actually happen mathematically? And a lot of Bitcoiners have seen this from the jump. Greg Foss, I think, is like probably the best guy to talk about this in particular. If you go listen to something that he's
the question you're kind of posing here, I think, is who's going to buy him, right? If there is such a structural break, a structural fracture in the system, who's going to buy him, right? If the Fed's trying to offload its balance sheet and it's the central bank, then who are they offloading to? Where does that get offloaded?
Exactly.
I don't know. I don't know what the answer is there.
And not to scare everybody. I mean, to a degree, I don't mean to sit here and scare everybody, but here's the thing. If you just look into history, this is essentially what every world superpower does. And it doesn't mean the end of America. It could mean the end of us as a superpower. And honestly, if you do look at the history chart, because of the way that money moves and how much faster society is now, world superpowers come and go quicker than they used to, in my opinion. I think America could have like if you want to go based on 1913, it's one thing. If you want to go based on 1971 or even 1941 with Bretton Woods, it's another thing. Then we would all of a sudden become like the shortest empire to ever exist. And it's because we are actually the worst perpetrators of financing the world's everything and essentially not doing anything here. I mean, I was listening to a podcast this week, rare earth minerals. There's one thing. We go out and farm out and use economies of scale and have contracts with other countries to buy essentially everything it takes to make a Tesla, to your phones, any of it. And we do this because they use slave labor. So it ends up being a little bit cheaper than just producing it here. And now, because inflation is so high, it's going to be a lot cheaper than producing it here because we all of a sudden are not as self-sufficient as we used to be. We can't afford to pay people $50 an hour to mine something to make our phone. If we did that, then our phones would all be like $20,000. And then you'd really start feeling inflation here. We're essentially able to dampen the inflation really through global slavery and utilizing other countries, what they're quote unquote better at than us. They're not better at it. It just can be done cheaper over there. And here's the thing, to not doomsday everybody, America does have everything. We have everything. You can do rare earth minerals. Rare earth minerals aren't something that you just find in a deposit somewhere like gold or something like that. Cobalt might be like that, whatever. Rare earth minerals are essentially just a very labor-intensive process that takes a lot of work wherever you are in order to get those rare earth minerals out from whatever earth that you're digging into. They're not like rare in the sense that we don't have them here. We have them here. We have oil here. I don't know if we have cobalt here, but you should probably argue that we might. I mean, the Sierra Nevadas kind of have everything that we need. We have everything that we need here. And we have chosen to, for the last 50, 60, 70 years, we've chosen to use this treasury market that we're talking about, and we've used banking because a lot of other countries, the biggest buyer of our treasuries have been, and are not now, but have been Japan. Japan doesn't have an interest rate, or they just increased it, and it's causing the yen to trade like a shitcoin. But they have essentially banked their entire economy on buying an assload of treasuries and using those interest payments from our government to pay their people or to finance whatever they're doing. And there's a lot of countries that have done that with US Treasuries for a while because, I mean, the government always pays its debts. But how are they always paying their debts? That's like the thing that nobody's talking about. They're able to pay them through a financial institution that is not voted on, that honestly hasn't caused this country anything but turmoil for 100 years. And it's central banking and the Federal Reserve. You could argue that you can have commercial banks through Bitcoin. You could argue that banking in general is a necessity of people, or that we're going to need some sort of financial institution to provide interest rates for a while as we come down off of this high. But essentially, America is like a coke addict, and it's getting like worse and worse and worse and worse. And they're about to try meth for the first time. They were doing coke for a while. Now we're about to be meth. And
okay, so Griff, I think this is a good part in the conversation to ask the question: in light of all of this, what are we to do?
I think there's only a couple. I mean, if now we're playing, should Nyc Griff become president of the United States? But I think that there is mathematically a way to get out of it, and I don't really think you're going to be able to do it through stagflation, and you're not going to be able to do it through the Federal Reserve. Things need to get repriced. I mean, and they need to get repriced in something better form of money. And we need to reduce our government spending to almost zero. We need to cut almost there are 12 million federal employees. And so by saying, oh, we should cut all this government spending, well, there's going to be you think migrants coming over the border is a problem. The labor market is going to see an influx of millions and millions of people. But you have to cut government spending everywhere that you can. You have to reduce income tax to almost nothing over time. And you have to essentially default on your debt. I mean, there's no other choice but to default on our debt. And the government, when you default on your debt, this is typically when a world war happens. So I think what we can do, hear me out here, utopia, dystopia. Dystopian, one thing we can do is default on our debt and tell everybody who owns treasuries that we don't like, the certain people that we don't like that are buying the treasuries, hey, we're not paying you anymore. And the money that you gave us for the principal, yeah, we're not going to be able to pay that back either. Like, you just gave us $5 trillion and we've been paying you a couple $100 million a year or whatever, $1 billion a year. Yeah. So like, you're just going to lose all of it. We just don't have it. We don't have any of the money, and we're really sorry. And if you want to fight about it, then we can go to war. We can do war. We'll just do that, which is typically what starts. You can talk about Hamas, Israel, Ukraine, Russia, Taiwan, China. You can talk about things all day long, guys, but it's when the money doesn't come due that there becomes problems. And America is about to be a country that's going to have to make a decision whether we want to continue to facilitate paying our debts or not. And a lot of the time we're going to say we're not. So that's one dystopian outlook, where we do have to go to world war in order to defend our world reserve currency. That has been what has happened almost every single time for the last 2,000 years. That has happened to every world superpower forever. Read the Bitcoin Standard, watch Ray Dalio's take on how China is going to take over the world in the Changing World Order video. Whatever version of history you want to look at, if you look at it from a money standpoint, this is what happens almost every single time. There's very few times that any underlying aspect of it is different. It's almost always tied to the money. Always. and I will continue to try. I watch a lot of history videos. I'll continue to try a time where the world reserve currency is affected otherwise. But pretty much every time it's when that country can't pay its debts anymore or it can't continue to finance its operation one way or the other, right? Here's the utopian view. Here's my take, just my take. I become president tomorrow. Not sure how much I can affect. You cut 90% of federal spending. You cut all the jobs, all of them. You cut all tax breaks and ties and anything of that nature, as many taxes as you can cut, taxing imports, exports, whatever. You bring business back to the States, all of it. You bring it all back. So not only do you simultaneously cut the federal deficit, which is what we're running on, you have to start being able to facilitate our government. We have to decide what we want to pay for, which if we're defaulting on our debt, then we probably need to continue to spend money on military. I think another thing that is a different conversation to get out of is you have to talk about Medicare and Medicaid, and you have to talk about how we would reverse that process and make healthcare affordable in our country for people while we go through this transitionary standpoint or transitionary time. And then whatever other money that you have, because now we just established we're going to cut Amtrak, okay? That's a government-funded train operation that hasn't made a profit in 60 years. We're going to cut them, okay? We're going to cut a lot of federal spending, and we're going to push it to the states. So that means basically the private sector is going to have to take up a lot more jobs. What does that really mean, guys? That means essentially we're not paying the government to be a third-party contractor anymore, which is really good because I promise you that is going to get sorted out a lot faster than this other part I'm talking about. The other part I'm talking about is taking all the money you're not spending on healthcare right away, all the money that you don't have to spend on our military budget right away, all of the money that it takes essentially to fund the most basic necessities of what we have going on. That way you can cut income tax and eventually reduce not only the deficit of our country, but you can start facilitating payment for certain things that we need as a country. The only other thing that our government can do is take our tax dollars and as a country embrace a new form of money or a new market or a new technology that has come out and mine the shit out of Bitcoin. You have to mine the shit out of it because that is actually the only way that they're going to be able to finance anything that they're doing and not also piss off the entire world. So if I'm president, I cut everything that I can. I essentially create a surplus within our budget, only basic necessities. The goal is to get income taxes down, but while income taxes are still high because we're trying to pay these things down, we take the surplus, we mine Bitcoin, and we use that Bitcoin mining. How are we going to do the Bitcoin mining? Yeah, guys, we could do this for fucking 10 hours. We could talk about all the different energy sectors, all different reasons to start mining Bitcoin, how much Bitcoin we have, and we take the Bitcoin and we pay our debts. And simultaneously, we also ease ourselves into this harder money economy or an economy that is now backed by Bitcoin. And I think we could pay down our debts. We could still facilitate spending where it's needed over a course of time. And we could essentially usher in a new working class to America. Because, guys, there are jobs. The AI thing is so cute. It's awesome. I love the AI thing. I love it. And I hope AI, you could view that America has gotten out of similar situations like this because we've always had technology come to the States, like the internet. You could argue the internet has exacerbated what they were able to do in 1971 because you're bringing all this new business, all these new jobs. So all of a sudden the economy grows so much that you could print all kinds of money and you would be fine. But the real problem in America today is that our real GDP or our economic GDP is so far below what we're spending on top of all of the financial problems that we just have. We're basically, we're broke as shit. We don't have any money, but we have a great product and we can make our product again. And the product is America, a real America. Right now, this is like fake, but we can become the largest exporter. We can become the largest, really the largest middle-class economy again in the world. I don't know, Nick, how long do you think that would take? I mean, it would probably take some time, but I think that's like the utopian view. I don't really see how the government gets out of paying $37 trillion because, mind you guys, some of that's the foreign entities that would get pissed off. Some of that is domestic. Some of that is you guys literally going to the bank and they don't have your money. And it's just like, all right, we're screwed. That's like way worse than the Great Depression. That's like the Great Depression plus anarchy plus the end of America. It really is. So you have to think about how we're actually going to pay back our debt. And essentially create a leaner economy that is built from the middle class out. And the only way to do that is through true capitalism. Don't let anybody lie to you. Do not let anybody lie to you. There is no way to build a middle class through government spend. The government ain't going to help you guys. I'm just telling you. They don't know how to create an even playing field.
This is just what I was thinking, Griff, and you're leading right into it, is that at one point the government was supposed to secure the medium, and then the free market operated within this medium that enables all of these micro economies to emerge organically. They're trying to also operate and allocate resources within the free and open market, which exactly what you're saying here, right? There's nothing that's going to substitute the free market. Nothing is a better allocator of resources than the free market. And as soon as you start getting into the middle of that as a central operator, a central controller, a central authority, and you're not perfect, things tend to go really bad. And as technology has been introduced into humanity, we've seen a seemingly increasing rate of rise and fall, if you will. Right. As information flows faster, things tend to happen quicker. Decisions are made quicker. Capital is allocated quicker. It's liquidated quicker. Everything happens at a faster rate. And when the government is no longer solely focused on securing the medium, but now on trying to operate in the free market, they start to expand, they start to grow to where you see those large numbers like you're talking about, Griff, where you've got 1 million different departments, you've got millions of people that are employed by the government, and not to mention just the employees of the government, but the people that are living on government subsidy. Then more and more people start to become dependent on the government as opposed to on themselves. Now, where we've got to watch out for the trap here is the prideful trap, in thinking that it's all on me, because I don't think it's all on an individual. I think it's a part of operating in a certain way within a larger collective that enables us to all really experience.
I think
if we want to call it abundance or something else, I think it's about the collective to some degree. Now, I have to give glory to God because that's my faith, but different conversation.
No, but that's the mindset. And I think that here's a really good example. And this is why I think, everything in life is sales. And Nick and I are both, this is like a sales podcast. You're really just getting takes from two different sales guys, one in commercial contracting and the other in med device sales at this point. Well, so the thing about it is, to go on a rant, and kind of what we're talking about is the nature of the economy now has turned into a who you know economy, not a what you know economy. And what becomes the problem with a who you know economy is that, oh, you work for the government? Oh, what do you sell? Oh, yeah, this is supposed to be a really hard process, and the government is essentially the one who decides it. But once you get the contract, this is like the easiest sale that you've ever had in your life, and you're just getting free money. And when you have 12 million federal employees, when you have $7 trillion spent a year, there are a lot of people out there that you can just take every example. Nick and I are no different. You go through a sales process, which is the driver of the economy. And while going through that sales process, you realize, holy crap, if I can just become friends with a few government employees, I can probably make enough sales for the next 30 years and never really have to work. And I think that has a trickle-down effect. I think actually that is coming from a trickle-down effect of really easy money times, in the fact that our government is so big and they have so much money that it's causing an extraordinary amount of problems in all these microeconomies that Nick was just talking about. You can't have a society that is run by big government, because government employees and bureaucrats and people that have a fixed salary and aren't ever going to get out of their job are not only lazy, but they create inefficiencies everywhere. Like I was just saying, if you're in sales, does not matter what industry you're in, there is probably some government form of sale, and everybody knows if you get the government account, you're going to get a lot of easy money just because you knew somebody and just because you understood the process. And that's happening everywhere all the time. And if you moved into more of I'm trying to think the last time government was small. Who cares? If you move back into
the 18... Griff, let me give you a thought here. So in my industry, in commercial construction, there are what is known as publicly funded projects or public projects. And The case in this industry is the exact opposite of what you described.
Yeah, but
actually,
I completely disagree. I mean, like the case in your industry is that you guys all bid on projects, and technically speaking, the lowest dollar bid is supposed to win, and that's kind of just what the government is supposed to pick. Is they're supposed to pick the most cost efficient option. But if you're actually in the industry, you can understand quite a few things about that would be wrong. What if that contractor just knows the person? What if they know that they know the person so well that they kind of can understand or get some of the bids? Maybe something is happening behind the scenes that's mischievous. And they know that if they just submit the lowest bid and they can figure out the number without actually having to put together a fair estimate, then all of a sudden it's not a fair bidding process. That would just be one way how you break that down. Another way how you break it down is,
sure. If we break the rules, then sure, absolutely.
Rules are broke. We literally started off this podcast by the fact that our central bank and our government are colluding and they're giving each other money. So of course that's happening in commercial construction and it's happening everywhere. But not only that, now you're also incentivizing what? We just build the cheapest shit. The government is employed to just build the cheapest option. Are government employees really the best arbitrator of who should get what bid for what building and what project and what infrastructure? Should they really be the ones deciding, or should a free market decide? Will we have nicer things?
The government doesn't decide. The government doesn't decide. They just allocate the capital. Not in every situation. Not in every situation. Because I'm just telling you. I know from my own perspective, my own industry. I've been working with a small city here in Oklahoma that has a handful of projects that they're looking at. Now, do they have government money? Yes, they have government money. But now, to your point, there could be Joe Blow from down the street that knows Billy Bob down at the city, and he's got some inside information, and that's gonna kind of put him in a better position to get that government money. Sure, there's absolutely that case. But I think in most situations, people that are in the decision-making process with a city in this case, or a lot of school projects are the same, right? Schools get allocated a federal grant, and then they're going to use that to build new facilities to support their school, right? Sure, there's absolutely got to be some inside information going and benefiting others indirectly, improportionately. There's that absolutely got to be something like that going on somewhere, right? There's got to be some of that stuff going on. But I know that I've specifically competed against other contractors for publicly funded projects that are not near as profitable as other private projects. Now, I'll tell you what is appealing about the public projects world is that there is a consistent flow of work that's being done. Now, you may not make as much on those individual projects as you would compared to a similar private project, but there's a much more consistent flow of that public work money. Now but where it is interesting is like the incentive, right? We think about the incentive is that if I want to win this public funded project, if I want to win this public project, that means that I've got to have a good competitive number. Okay, so how do I, as a general contractor, get together a good competitive number? Well, that means that I've got to have good relationships and got to know a lot of subcontractors that are going to perform all of the work, right? That means that I'm going to get multiple numbers per trade. Think about if I'm building a new building, I'm going to get 3 or 4 or 5 concrete numbers, 3 or 4 or 5 metal building or framing numbers. On all these different trades that we could think of, I'm going to get multiple numbers. And the public process is built in a way that a lot of the subcontractors will bid to every single general contractor that is bidding the project. And so there's this spreading out of the incentive throughout the industry where now I want to make sure I'm incentivized to select the lowest subcontractor number, the lowest qualified subcontractor number, because that puts me in a better position to be more competitive myself. And I also have to be in touch with the market to know where my markup should be, right? If I submit a $5 million project, $5 million proposal, and I've got it marked up at 25%, there's not a shot in hell that I'm winning that project. At a $5 million project, I need to probably be marked up around 4 to 5%. I need to make 4 to 5% to be competitive relative to the market here in my local area, right? In my local market, That's where I know that markup needs to be in that size range project. The caveat is that there can be some shady stuff going on in the background.
The caveat is also this is not a natural process. This is, like you said, you were kind of like, well, they just allocate the capital. That's, I mean, to a certain degree, isn't that all that matters? Is they're the ones allocating the capital, and so that means somebody had to go request the capital. That means that somebody at the government had to decide to give them that capital, and that means that said person knows how to get that capital from the other said person. And then they know how the bidding process works, so they know how to get lower margins, sure, or whatever. But somebody there is benefiting. Something about it is extremely inefficient. It's probably not going to produce the best project. Probably going to take a long time to get done. A lot of unhappy workers. A lot of slow. I mean, like nothing about what you just described.
Well, so that would be
that's
one process. The process that most people are actually moving to is a CM style process, a construction management process, where you collaborate from the very beginning as opposed to doing all of this work on the front end. It's actually much more efficient. There's not all of the you only get a competitive bid on the subcontractor side, which is a lot more natural, I think. It's more about relationships. But to your point, though, yeah, I mean, from the very beginning, though, the government is allocating capital. So then the question becomes, where should the government be allocating capital? Should the government be allocating capital? What are the roles of the government? That's when we get back to is their focus securing the medium, or are they operating in the medium? Are we securing the medium, or are we operating in the medium?
Well, and also like the point of my argument there is that if you have 12 million federal employees and you have a $7 trillion annual spend, that's just one industry. That's just like one city and one industry and how that goes. This is 50 states. There's lots of industries. There's lots of business happening. How much of the 7 trillion spent is just straight up super inefficient, collusion, whatever, bad actors, all of these things? What percentage of it? And how high of a percentage do you need to go, well, if this was just in the free market, like, yeah, like this would probably just work out a hell of a lot better and people would probably get paid better and there'd be more reason to have people here. Simultaneously, like kind of what I'm talking about as well is if we're talking about commercial construction or really anything, we're still getting a lot of our resources from other countries. We're not even getting them from here. So what happens if you bring that entire market back where you're actually producing the things to produce the other things in the States? Then you just have a ton of jobs, a ton of commerce, free markets figuring it out. The government isn't ruining businesses because they want to tax them because they need to be the ones. They need to be the one with the credit card. They need the credit card. The states can't have the credit card anymore. The government, like local people can't have the credit card anymore. Only the federal government gets to have the credit card. And whether that's public education, whether that's healthcare, whether that's commercial construction, whether that's logistics, whether that's just your taxes on your everyday money, the fact that these guys are the ones arbitrating and also allocating the capital is so beyond ridiculous. Just look at our $37 trillion deficit. Clearly, they're not very good at their job. What program has the government started that has ever ended? Never. None of them are ever successful, because if they were successful, then they would be gone. But they're never gone. They only get bigger. And I think that's kind of like the huge problem is like the more money you give them and the more people there are, and there's more government employees deciding projects and things like that, somehow, some way, they're scraping even more off the top to give it to intelligence agencies to run black ops, to do whatever they want in the world. And as an economy and the free people and all of these things, we have a tyrannical government at this point. We really do. I mean, like I heard it on a podcast. There is the Constitution of the United States, which is an awesome document. There's like a better one. It's called the Declaration of Independence. And the people of the United States at this point are definitely under a tyrannical form of government. That is not by the people, for the people. There's nothing going on in this country right now that isn't colluded. And I'm not sitting here saying that America is not the best place to live in the world. I still think it is the best place to live in the world right now. But where there's smoke, there's fire. And I've always been a person to try to put out that smoke before it becomes a fire. And it doesn't seem like, and I guess kind of nice wrap up to the old podcast here, Nick. It's kind of my problem. That's what I'm waking up thinking about, is I think there's a whole bunch of people that are looking at the smoke over there in the bushes and they're like, oh, that'll go out. Well, if you live in California, you know if there's smoke in the bushes, it doesn't go out. And it can become a massive fire and it can burn down cities and it can do all kinds of crazy shit. And we have some serious smoke, and nobody, whether this was the most articulate, well-presented discussion about treasuries and government deficits and how the whole thing kind of works behind the scenes, what you're like, the stuff that is working besides just equities and the NASDAQ and like the fun shit that you guys see every single day and what you're spending your money on a little bit, but what's happening behind the scenes and why are things getting worse and what could that lead to? That's the smoke. And there's a lot of smoke. Anybody could tell you there's a lot of smoke. Will it become a fire?
Seemingly, nobody wants the smoke.
No,
hey, if you guys are
wants...
not watching, you need to come watch us on YouTube and on Spotify. Come see us on Twitter. It's at Nyc and Griff Show. That's all spelled out at NYCANDGRIFFSHOW. We like to talk with folks there. Griff, give us one last word and then say peace to the people.
Buy Bitcoin. And I buy as much as you can. Peace.